Welcome to the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, webinar number 3 in a series of 4, which is called Make Your Organization More Accessible and Inclusive. So staff and leadership of organizations charged with implementing and monitoring anti-racism and anti-oppression organizational change are often challenged with, where do we start? And so part of that challenge is in being clear about what ARAO-related initiatives look like in practice. And for this series of webinars, OCASI's Access and Equity Standards will provide an explicit guidepost specifically as it relates to the immigrant-serving sector. So this third webinar in the series of 4 will continue our discussion on assessing organizational readiness. And areas that will be covered by this third webinar include a recap of the specific areas for assessment, assessment criteria, ideas for moving assessment forward in your organization, and beginning to consider additional mechanisms for meaningful change. And so, hello, my name is Beth Jordan, and I own and operate Adobe Consulting Services, and we do training, planning, and evaluation for not-for-profit organizations, and I've been honored to be doing this work in community for about 15 years. My colleague, Douglas Stewart.
Hi there. Welcome back. So if you are new on the webinar, welcome. But for the folks, I know who you're rejoining us again as the third of the series. My name is Douglas Stewart, and I own and operate Competence Consultants and Associates, and we do similar work as Beth has described for Adobe Consulting Services. And I think the last time, a few times we've introduced ourselves, we talked about the fact that one of the things that's important to us is our commitment to social justice issues. And the way that we work and what we're sharing with you in this series of webinars is to really make substantial change and meaningful change in your organization. So looking forward to working with you today as well.
Okay. And you may notice you will notice, there's no audience. So we did this originally a year ago, November 19th, actually, 2013. And unfortunately, technology, a lovely thing when it works and not so much when it doesn't. The original webinar with the audience was lost. So we are re-recording this for you. So we will try our best to remember the conversations related to the polls and bear with us as we move through. So webinar 3, as we discussed, the objective is to continue reviewing considerations for assessing readiness for ARAO organizational change within your organizations. And the areas that we're covering in this one are those areas for assessment and the assessment criteria, because that's been a constant piece, So, okay, these are the areas, but then what is the criteria? What are we looking for? What's the baseline that we want to be achieving? So we're going to discuss that in some detail. And then, very importantly, who shepherds the process? So again, to recap, the areas of impact that we encourage organizations to look at, and I should say that this is not, there may be other areas that we haven't identified that you identify, and that is completely fine. But for our purposes, we have a sort of a core set of areas that we look at, and we'll again recap those for you. So organizational and foundational statements and documents. So that's, all your foundational statements like your mission, vision, your values, principles if you have them. Some people call them beliefs and aims. And these are the things that you want to be, one of the areas you want to be looking at. Are they in alignment with an ARAO framework? Program policies and procedures. So all of the written statements which guide and direct how your programs and services will operate. Your program practices. How are people actually executing on those policies and procedures? What is in fact really happening on the ground in your organization? Personnel policies, procedures, and practices, right? So same as above, except these are related to the HR component of your organization: hiring, career pathing, employment equity, workplace behavior, etc. Another area of impact, professional development. So skills and training, how you professionally develop, provide training opportunities that will impact the skills and abilities of the folks who deliver your services. We also encourage you to look at the composition and climate of your organization. So what's your structure look like? How do people communicate within that structure? Who has decision-making power? How is decision-making communicated? You know, a number of things to look at. Who's in your organization? You know, what are the various social identities that people claim in that organization? Where are the gaps? Community consultation and communication. So how are you engaged in community? In what ways? Using which vehicles? And with what frequency? So we asked when the audience was with us back in November, which areas of impact has your organization in fact developed criteria to assess baseline level of practice. And so we asked people in each of those areas, and I can't remember exactly what people said, but there was a range. As I'm looking at these, I'm reminded that in terms of skills and training, people said somewhat, and then, you know, we're typing things like resources are an issue. So for all of these things, people were flagging, right, both human and financial resources as being a component as to why they were either responding with a no or a somewhat. Several folks, in terms of programs and program policies and procedures and practices, had in fact developed criteria, and we're doing some assessment work in those areas. But when we start to think about community engagement, organizational composition and climate, we got more towards the somewhat and no responses, if I'm remembering correctly. Mm-hmm. Is that what you remember as well, Douglas?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And then we moved on to poll the group in the next question, which was which areas of impact has your organization developed criteria to measure success? So in fact, evaluate, right, in working towards access and equity standards, and the same thing. So while people may have started to think about criteria or even started to develop criteria, they weren't in fact able to or had yet to have an evaluation process around that. So that was the next step to move to. And again, always want to, where you can, be evaluating your impact, right? So the evaluation piece is very important. All right. So area of impact and criteria statements. So what are the things that would say, yes, we are starting to do, or we are aiming to, or this is how we live and model the ARAO framework and culturally competent practice. So with organizational foundational statements and documents, your documents have been communicated, right, where appropriate to clients and community stakeholders or are available to them, so they know where they can find them. The process to develop the organizational and foundational statements and documents was an inclusive one, and it was a transparent one. And it wasn't something that just sort of happened around a board table, but it engaged management, staff, and stakeholders, external stakeholders and clients of the organization in responding to and assisting in the development process. There's been a process to review or renew organizational and foundational statements. And that process in and of itself was transparent, inclusive, and involving multiple stakeholders. And that there is a process in place to review and renew going forward, right, those statements. So those are 4 examples of criteria statements in that particular area of impact. In terms of program policies and procedures, that, again, you're noticing a theme, consultation, right? So that policies have been developed in consultation and with input from staff and clients where appropriate, and that the folks that you are talking to actually reflect the diversity of your community. Policies that should be shared with clients, again, are available in multiple languages and or Braille and audio tape, and that policies are supported by and made operative through related procedures. So there's congruence. Policies and procedures are again communicated, not just in one way, but in multiple ways. Staff, students, volunteers actually receive training sessions on policies and procedures to ensure understanding and application. And Douglas and I like to call this training to policy, right? So you create a policy in your organization, you tell people this is the policy, but then you don't sit down and talk to them about what might be the practical application of this. What does it mean on the ground? And do you actually have the skills and ability to ensure that you're going to live this policy? We want to support our teams. So that's that last bullet, and it's a really important one.
And this is a really critical one, because the anchoring that you can see is that even in development of the policy, so you start also with the stakeholders. And what Beth is really saying at the end about training to policy is that then you also end with the stakeholders, right? So because at the end of the day, it's who's going to have to live, implement, breathe, experience, the impact of these policies and these procedures, right? So it's really critical at the front end that what you're doing is you're also getting input from folks who are going to be affected to also inform how your staff, volunteers on the board has an understanding and works with these policies and apply them. So that's why, you start with hearing from the folks going to affect, but then also you make sure you build the capacity once you have the policy in place for the folks who are going to have to implement and apply it.
So the program practices area of impact, and this again was where folks felt more confident that they had actually been doing this in their organization. So criteria statements could include that your client groups are reflective of the community that you're serving. Again, this is an identification of are there gaps, right? Are people not present in your organization that you know are in the community or the target community that you're working with? A range of culturally appropriate and or specific service delivery models are planned, developed, and implemented. And again, the how, the way in which they're planned, we've talked about in the previous slide. Programs are developed, reviewed through community consultation, are regularly assessed with respect to identifying gaps, barriers, or appropriate services in terms of cultural needs, and that they're reviewed for consistency with policies and procedures. And of course, there is a mechanism by which people can let you know if they are having a negative or harmful impact, or if there have been any problems or concerns. So a complaint resolution process is used and is effective. For personnel policies, procedures, and practices, and then what skills and training we'll talk about next, policies are adapted into procedures, and again, reviewed for consistency, right? Performance evaluations should have a section on culturally competent practice, or the ARAO framework. So what is the expectation, and translate that into behaviors, right? You can measure that, you can see it, you can evaluate it. You have developed as an organization concrete job competencies, right? And we just talked about that. So in terms of skills and training, you want to be making sure that people have the access to professional development that will allow them to hone those kinds of skills and to challenge themselves, right? Personally, professionally, with an impact politically. So the organization is providing training to all staff. There is an annual budget and a group professional development that is targeted specifically at anti-racist and anti-oppression practice. Internal stakeholders are made aware of training and skills development opportunities outside of the organization, and that participation in those kind of opportunities is encouraged and supported. In terms of the climate and the composition of the organization, there are a number of criteria statements here, and this list could go on and on and on. So we want to encourage you, all of what we're talking about here is just a place to start. And you would take this information and tailor it to what makes sense in your organization. But you do want to get a sense of who is there, who's in your organization, how old are they, what is the range of sexual orientation, of ability, of gender. You need to know, and this is done through processes where people are able to self-identify. That your organization staff have a good level, excellent level even, of awareness of ARAO. The organization provides an environment that is welcoming for clients. And who's going to tell you that? Clients, right? It's not what you think, it's what they tell you has been their experience. That you have created a physical environment that is reflective of multiple cultures. And culture is a very big thing. It's not just about ethnicity and race. It is about the whole range of social locations. So visually, you want to make sure that you're not throwing up barriers and in fact are providing a space that feels accessible and where people can see multiple areas of their social identities reflected in ways that are appropriate. As an organization that you actually have devices such as TTY, are able to use Bell Relay, you have Braille signage in the building, you have the range of equipment needed to support access for folks with multiple, for deaf and hard of hearing folks, visually impaired people, but people along the continuum of ability. As a staff or a student, people feel comfortable in the organization. So it's not just about, we're talking about the experience of the client, but how does your workforce feel? How are people who are delivering the services feeling? Do you feel like you have access at all structural levels of the organization? Are there concrete ways in which diverse religion and culture, cultural expression is celebrated, respected, and space is provided for that to happen, and that people from multiple backgrounds are participating in the organization? In terms of community consultation and communication, important that you are thinking about what engagement can look like. Ethical engagement, engagement that is about inclusive practice, so that the knowledge and experience of community resources are recognized and utilized when you're designing programs and services, that there is a collaboration and partnership in terms of how to develop and to deliver these services. That you actually have a community engagement strategy, and an engagement strategy that has been vetted by folks other than you, right? That your communication materials are available, again, in multiple languages, including Braille and where appropriate audio tape, and that you have a communication strategy that has been developed with input from multiple stakeholders, that you're regularly updating and reviewing your communication collateral materials, and that they have been vetted for cultural appropriateness. And there's a communication policy and procedure in place. So, how will we communicate and what will that look like? So there is a consistency and there is an expectation of a baseline minimum standard as to how we will interact through our communication. And I'm going to pass it over to Douglas at this point.
And hopefully you might remember this image from the first webinar that we did with you. Again, the polar bear, and we've had this debate from folks who've seen this, and people who I guess who have experience in the north say that they think it's a husky.
Oh.
We think it's an Arctic fox. That's my gaze. And I think we've been saying that.
I say, Arctic wolf, but husky.
Yeah, some people have said that they think it's a husky, and there's been debates even among them from the north about it's a husky, it's a wolf, it's a fox. So, but we're open to whatever you interpret it as being. But hopefully, again, you get the message of, the polar bear with his or her size, enveloping the husky, and with all the good intentions of treating it well and loving it and having a good time with it. But the poor husky, based on just the size of this bear and maybe historical experience of being eaten alive, maybe have lost some family members to other polar bears, suddenly thinks I'm lunch, right, or dinner or whatever's coming. So similarly, when you start to look at your organization and go through this assessing your organization, always remember that part of what you are the bear at the end of the day for clients who are coming in vulnerable, getting services from you, but also people who are going through screening processes to potentially be hired in your organization, to maybe join your board or your volunteer pool. You're the big bear, right? So, you have to think about it in terms of what your messaged beliefs might have been, or to the community, really critically, right? What your demonstrated behaviors are. And then what also is important is meaningful action, right? So because at the end of the day, all of that will only be understood based on the actual, impact, right, that people have, right? So what is the actual measurable impact that people can give you feedback around in terms of their experience of you? Because as you see in the graphic, your beliefs don't make you the better person, it's your behavior, right? Think about it this way. How can you ever judge someone's intent? Right? People say, oh, just like the bear, the poor husky is going, oh, I don't know how to, you might you might say all these lovely things, but frankly, my family member who were your lunch and your previous ancestors' lunch and dinner, they also thought they were having a good deal as well, right? And any of us, if you think back to the histories of how oppression has worked through colonization, imperialism, especially on this land, Turtle Island, Aboriginal territory, contested land that we're all occupying and navigating all kinds of rights and resources and so on, we understand that the history has been like the big polar bear, right, which is the Canadian government, the construction of this country called Canada, that has also had particular reproductions and Aboriginal people who are still waiting, like the Huskies in this scenario, right, for how is this really going to have meaning. So if you go through all these again, what are the beliefs and messages of this country? What are the behaviors that people have experienced? What's actually the kind of actions that people have experienced that means that the impact is felt in the way that it is? So similar, if you reflect on your organization as the entity it is that's trying to implement an area or framework, you want to make sure at the end of the day that folks who are experiencing that we have ways of measuring that in fact our beliefs, our message through clear behavior and action that has real impact. And, we'll flip back a little bit back to that slide, actually, because the thing that Beth will often say with this piece that's really critical, you do it all over again, right? So as you do this assessment, you get folks' feedback and input. What you have to know is that you don't just do it once and think, okay, we're good for all time, right? It's a consistent, ongoing process, just like, an area or organization change process is constantly ongoing, constantly shifting and changing. Think of things like how legislation shifts and changes. Think of also immigration policy that you're working with. Think about refugee, legislation. Think about also what are the issues going on in the world that mean that who might be the next wave of folks who come to our territory, what that will look like. Think also about the ongoing negotiation of Aboriginal peoples to the treaty obligations that this government has entered into with their ancestors, frankly, because many of those people aren't here anymore, which are continuing to be dishonored and have to be negotiated. And I think it's a really important comment that we need to have also when we talk about immigrant providing agencies, that's an important education for us also, all of us in Canada, around the honoring of that history and heritage of Aboriginal people's disenfranchisement, as we also struggle to ensure that, we honor the obligations for folks who are also occupying this land, right?
Well, I think it's important that we say that and we make sure that it's understood that it's distinct,
yes.
Right? And so we're not conflating with some of the other things that we've been talking about. So we see that as distinct. And then in terms of your organization, because you are working with folks who, Canada is, a country of immigrants. All Canada is populated by people, when we're not talking about Turtle Island, we're not talking about Indigenous and Aboriginal people from somewhere else, right? So whether you came 150 years ago, 200 years ago, 10 years ago, are yesterday, right? And so you are thinking about and having to contend with what is, the discourse now socially. How is that impacting immigrants and newcomers? And there's a lot to be thinking about. And so it's really important that you're part of the solution and you don't become part of the problem, right?
And in that vein, part of what when we work with certain organizations like yours out there, they have made clear solidarity statements as allies with efforts around Aboriginal people's experiences of this territory, including looking at ways that there's partnering, there's shared advocacy, that there's also an honoring and connection to all those conversations. Because again, if you start to think about, when you talk about social justice issues, if you're a social justice oriented organization and thinking as a bigger picture in terms of how this is all intersectional with other kinds of movements of social justice, it's really important to continue to be part of that larger conversation. And so as we move through this conversation with the earlier taping of this particular webinar, as you know, we are again going at this for a second time. We had polled the group that was listening, and one of the questions that we had was, given the criteria statements in each area of impact that we just reviewed, please rank how you think your organization might score in working towards access and equity standards in each area of impact, right? And again, this is an interesting one because most people did respond by saying it's in progress, right? And again, kind of in that middle. I mean, a number of people also said, though, that frankly, because this was sort of new ways of looking at this, some of them are more